This week on Jerusalem Dateline, CBN News correspondents take a look back at 2015 and discuss the major events affecting our world: the expansion of ISIS, the emergence of Russia as a major player in the Middle East, the Iranian nuclear deal, terror hitting Europe, anti-Semitism rising, and a new wave of terror hitting the Jewish state. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this special year in review edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Nearly 13 years after 9/11 and 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the threat from Islamic terrorism against America is far from over. As we've shown you in our coverage of the Islamic State in Iraq, the threat is growing. Eric Steckelbach brings us this alarming look at today's leading terrorists and their plans for the United States.
Before Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became what many consider the world's most powerful terrorist, he was in U.S. custody. U.S. forces released al-Baghdadi from an Iraqi prison in 2009 after 4 years in captivity. His reported parting words to American troops: "I'll see you guys in New York." Al-Baghdadi now leads a terrorist army of some 10,000 jihadists, known variously as ISIS or the Islamic State. They've conquered a vast amount of territory in Iraq and Syria, and their threats to attack America have not gone unnoticed. Former Treasury Department and FBI analyst Matthew Levitt says the large influx of Western Muslims into ISIS's ranks from places like Britain, France, and Denmark poses a unique danger.
What makes it such a threat to us is its intent and its capability to carry out attacks abroad. The fact that it has recruited and drawn into it so many foreigners, some of whom have already gone home, and some of their leaders, including al-Baghdadi, have articulated an intent to carry out attacks abroad, possibly even in the United States.
Eric, thanks for being with us on this year in review story. As you look back on 2015 in terms of ISIS and the war on Islamic terror, what are the things that really strike you?
We had ISIS bringing down a Russian airliner over Egypt. We had horrific attacks in Beirut and, of course, Paris. And here where I'm sitting in the United States, in San Bernardino, California, we had 2 ISIS sympathizers carrying out a horrific jihadist attack, killing 14 people. So I think the big takeaway about ISIS is, look, they're being pressed now. Russia, the Turks, France, the U.S., all bombing ISIS positions in Syria and Iraq. But as that's happening, ISIS seems to be spreading outwards, outside of the caliphate in North Africa, the Middle East, and yes, right here in the West. And my fear, Chris, as we go forward into 2016, is that more of these ISIS sympathizers on American, European soil will rise up, and you have the returnees, Western citizens coming back from the battlefield and ready to strike here.
That's right, and the Obama administration has said at one time that they were contained. I know he meant that geographically, but do you see this spreading and these quote-unquote lone wolf attacks? I know that's a bit of a misnomer, but really the caliphate is asking these people to go ahead and take their own initiative.
Yeah, Chris, when history tells us, right, when someone tells you they want to kill you, you should probably listen. ISIS is telling us exactly what they want to do, Chris. As you mentioned, ISIS leaders have called on what they refer to as city wolves here in the United States and in Europe to rise up. And the FBI director, James Comey, Chris, said recently that we have some 1,000 ISIS-related cases here in America spread across all 50 U.S. states. So the barbarians are not just at the gates, they're inside the gates.
Exactly. Now, the attack in San Bernardino really seemed to send a shockwave to Americans. What do you think they need to know about this war on Islamic terror? How do they prepare for the days ahead?
Americans need to know, Westerners need to know, and of course Israelis already know, but we here in the West need to know that this is not going away anytime soon. Sadly, Chris, I would say that before January 2017, when President Obama leaves office, not much is going to change in terms of strategy here in the U.S., but I think, look, people need to be encouraged because God still sits on the throne. Watch, wait, pray, be vigilant, be aware, and be educated. Be ready for anything.
Great words, Eric. Sobering, but also encouraging. Thanks for being with us on this show, and we'll look to see what happens in 2016, and we'll be watching and praying.
Thank you, Chris.
One of the major developments this past year was Russia's expanded involvement in the Syrian civil war. We discussed this new development with Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg. Vladimir Putin has come into Syria in a big way militarily. What's your reaction to this development?
We are watching a catastrophic capitulation by the American government in the Middle East. It was bedrock U.S. foreign policy for 6-7 decades to keep the Russians out of the Middle East. And yet we have, the President Obama and his administration have surrendered. We have withdrawn, we have surrendered, we have ceded the playing field to Vladimir Putin, who is a czar rising. He's an imperialist. He's dangerous. And the fact that he is operating with abandon, with complete freedom, militarily, just a few miles north of Israel is stunning and incredibly dangerous.
Well, joining us to talk more about Russia's involvement in the Middle East is Gary Lane. Gary, looking back in 2015, how would you gauge the involvement of Russia and how significant was it?
It's extremely significant, Chris. What this means is an escalation of the war in Syria. There have been many more refugees that have fled the bombing that Russia's been involved in. There have been also many more civilian deaths as a result of that bombing, and also the potential of a greater conflict drawing in Turkey and Russia against one another.
You know, U.S. policy for decades has been trying to keep the Soviet Union years ago and now Russia out of the Middle East. What are the consequences for the United States in the Middle East?
You know, it's almost like we've invited them in. Go ahead and do what we are unwilling to do. And matter of fact, some critics are saying, critics of the Obama administration say the Russians are doing a better job of going after ISIS. But in fact, they're doing more than just go after ISIS. They're attacking others, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the consequences for the United States, we are a member of NATO. And if Russia goes against Turkey and attacks Turkey, that would draw the United States and also the other NATO allies, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies, into a conflict against Russia. I don't think anyone wants that, but there is that potential.
And what do you think of the consequences for Israel? Now, this puts Russia on its border with Syria, just about an hour's or 2-hour drive here from Jerusalem.
Well, I'm sure Israel is not very happy about that. I know Bibi Netanyahu has met with Putin, and I'm sure they've discussed the Russian troops being very close to the Israeli border. But I'm sure Israel also does welcome the fact that Russia is going after these militant Islamic groups, not just ISIS, but also attacking others that not only want to overthrow Assad, but guess who they're going to target once Assad's overthrown? I guess it probably will never happen now that Russia's involved, but Israel is the ultimate target, are they not?
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people are talking about Ezekiel 38 and 39 when you see Russia involved up in Syria right now. What do you see looking ahead, Gary, in 2016? How do you see this playing out?
You know, I think that's anyone's guess at this time. Obviously, the bombing has brought it to a new level, the Russian bombing. And then when the Turks shot down the Russian aircraft, that also brought it to another level. So it all depends. The Russians now have a second air base inside Syria. They also have anti-aircraft missiles. If there's another shoot down of another plane, or if Russia shoots down a Turkish airliner, a jet fighter, guess what? Then we could have a big conflict. So we'll have to keep a close eye on it, Chris, but it could escalate. We'll have to watch and see.
I agree. We'll be definitely keeping a close eye on it. Gary, thanks for your expertise. Coming up, a look back at the dangers Israel faced in the epicenter of the Middle East storm in 2015. Welcome back. The past year has been a tumultuous one for Israel. Political drama, a new wave of terror, and the Iranian nuclear deal were all part of 2015 for the Jewish state. Israel began the year with a pivotal election. Despite polls and pundits, Israeli Prime Minister defeated his closest rivals and became the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. He formed a narrow one-seat majority and so far has managed to keep his coalition together. Netanyahu also made a controversial visit to the U.S. Congress. Despite objections by the White House, he made an impassioned plea against an agreement with Iran about its nuclear program.
To defeat ISIS and let Iran get nuclear weapons would be to win the battle but lose the war. We can't let that happen.
When the U.S. and other world powers agreed to a deal, Netanyahu said it all but guaranteed Iran would become a nuclear power. But Netanyahu and Israel not only had to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat, but dangers in the heart of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount once again became a flashpoint when Palestinian leaders claimed Israel wanted to change the status quo. Their incitement led to a new wave of terror throughout Israel. Some called it the stabbing intifada, where random and indiscriminate stabbings, shootings, and cars being used as deadly weapons swept the land. 2015 is ending with no end in sight to this latest wave of terror. Joining us to talk more about what's happened in Israel in the past year is CBN correspondent Julie Stahl. Julie, talking about that election earlier this year, it really was a surprise to a lot of people, wasn't it?
Yes, Chris, many Israelis were surprised. We were there on election night at Likud party headquarters. Many of the experts, the exit polls had already started to predict that Netanyahu had not won the largest majority for his party, and indeed he did. So yes, many Israelis were surprised by that. The right wing, of course, was very happy, but it did not help with the Iranian nuclear deal.
Netanyahu's lobbied against that for years, and yet it has been passed and agreed to by the U.S. and 5 other world powers. What impact is that going to have on Israel?
Well, you know, right now it's under the radar screen. Nobody's really talking about Iran too much these days. Of course, Iran, I'm sure, is continuing its pursuit of nuclear power or nuclear weapons. And you know, Israel is for sure keyed in on that. They may have missed their window for now in terms of a military strike, but I'm sure that for Israel, it's still right there. It's a major threat.
Another thing here in Israel for the last several months, Julie, has been this wave of terror. What impact is that having on Israelis?
Well, you know, Israelis are used to having terror attacks. They're used to terror waves. This particular one, I just wanted to read these statistics. Since September 13th, there have been more than 20 Israelis killed, 215 wounded in 90 stabbing attacks, more than 30 shooting attacks, and 14 car ramming attacks. That's an average of more than 2 terror attacks a day. So Israelis, you know, I mean, that's jarring, but they've returned to their normal lives, their normal activities, and of course Israel has stepped up its security around the country. And you know, the one thing that made this particular wave of terror different is the fact that people were using knives and household implements, cars, to carry out the attacks. It's a much more personal kind of terror attack, but as we've said, you know, that Israelis are really, they're strong people, they're amazing people, and they have returned to their normal activities.
Finally, Julie, in light of all these terror attacks, how can people be praying for the peace of Jerusalem?
Well, you know, Chris, the Bible exhorts us to pray for our government. I would say pray for the Israeli government. Pray that they'll have wisdom. Pray that they'll know how to deal with the situations that are around them, because they really need wisdom that's not from this earth. They really need wisdom from above. I would also say pray for dreams and visions for the Palestinians, for the Arab people around here, that they would come to know the Lord, that they would be prevented from carrying out these attacks.
Good ideas for prayer, Julie, and thanks for your expertise and analysis, and we'll be praying for this coming year. Up next, 2015 saw a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. What impact will this have on Europe's future? Welcome back to this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Within Europe this year, terrorist attacks and rising anti-Semitism have convinced more and more European Jews there's no future for them or their children in Europe. That's leading to an exodus of the Jews unprecedented since the creation of Israel. Dale Hurd has the story.
More and more European Jews are asking if it's time to leave. European governments seem unable to prevent rising terrorist attacks against Jews, and that's made Jews as fearful as they've been since the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism in Europe has become stronger both because of more Muslim immigration and because of the leftist European media's constant demonization of Israel.
We have facing different kind of anti-Semitism, what we can call the traditional anti-Semitism, which is a centuries-old anti-Semitism, and the new phase of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism, the critic of Israel, who is hiding actually a real anti-Semitism.
Well, joining us to talk more about anti-Semitism in Europe is Dale Hurd. Dale, you've reported on Europe for many years now. What strikes you in the past year about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe?
Well, of course, it began violently in France, and in a country like Belgium, which I focused on, not as many high damage attacks. But what really bothered me when I spent time in Belgium and talking to a lot of Jews there is especially the young people, they've accepted the fact that when they go out in public, they have to hide their Jewishness. I think this is a terrible sign, and it should not have to happen in a democracy, in a Western society, and they're accepting it. And to me, that's a slippery slope into something worse.
What do you see, you know, one of the biggest things this past year with this massive influx of Muslims, hundreds and hundreds of thousands into Europe. What impact is that going to have on the continent?
Well, it's a safe but sad prediction that there are going to be more terrible attacks against Jews in Europe because you have this blood hatred of Jews among some of the immigrants. Some would say many of the Muslim immigrants that are pouring in to Europe, and it's the quiet. I'm sorry, it's a bad cliche, but it's the quiet before the storm. It's coming, and I think, you know, Zaka has been in Europe trying to help Jews get ready for what they call mass casualty events.
Wow, wow. So, looking forward to 2016, you think it's going to get worse, Dale?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry to say, I think Jews would admit that privately as well. It's mathematical at this point.
Yeah. You know, Time magazine chose Angela Merkel as Time Person of the Year. Do you find that a little bit ironic?
Why? Because they also chose Hitler? In the 1930s. Well, you know, they chose her as one of the biggest newsmakers of the year, and for Jews, she's one of the biggest troublemakers of the year because and the European Union as well, what they're bringing into Europe. Because as everyone says in Europe, if the Jews leave Europe, Europe will no longer be Europe.
Right. Unfortunately, that looks like it's true. We talked to an Israeli expert that said the very same thing to us just a few days ago. Dale, thanks for your reporting. We appreciate it. It's just excellent and insightful, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up, an in-depth look at the alarming trend around the world in 2015, persecution of Christians. Welcome back to this Year in Review program. Tragically, Christian persecution is on the rise around the world, and according to a new report from Open Doors USA, radical Islam is the driving force. CBN's George Thomas has that story.
The persecution of Christians is real, it is horrifically violent often, and it is spreading at an unprecedented rate in modern times.
Dr. David Curry is president of Open Doors, a group that monitors religious freedom worldwide. He says Christians face the most persecution for their faith in 2014 than in any other year in recent history.
We have seen the sharpest jump in violent attacks against Christians in the modern era.
Rounding the top 10 worst violators are Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iran, Pakistan, Eritrea, and Nigeria. But in a majority of the countries, Curry says elements of one religion above all poses the greatest threat to Christians.
Islamic extremism is a driving force, is really the driving force in 40 of the top 50 countries on the World Watch List.
Meanwhile, the terrorist group known as Islamic State, or ISIS, continues to drive hundreds of thousands of Christians from Syria and Iraq. Curry worries their success at targeting minority faiths is giving impetus to other radical groups to pursue similar tactics around the world.
So you have the Islamic State, their tactics, their methodology now being adopted by Boko Haram, by Al-Shabaab and others. And so I think this means that while this year was the worst ever, things look very troubling for years to come.
Joining us now to talk more about the persecution of Christians here in the Middle East is George Thomas. George, how serious a problem is this in the Middle East?
It's very serious. I know you have been reporting, we've been reporting here on CBN News for several years. It has unfortunately taken a dramatic escalation since the Syria war. You have about 200,000 plus Syrians who have died, so many Christians who have lost their lives in the process, tens of thousands who've been displaced. We're not just talking about Syria. Remember what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're talking about a large swath swath of the Middle East, from the shores of Casablanca all the way to Herat, Afghanistan, where you've had Christians who have been, in some sense, they've lost their lives, they've been displaced, as have millions of Muslims. So this is a very, very serious problem.
How would you make this real to Christians in the West and the United States in particular? What do they need to know about what's happening to their brothers and sisters in the Middle East?
Bottom line, Chris, what's happening to our brothers and sisters in the Middle East is that they're dying. They're being displaced. They are on the run. We're talking about tens of thousands of folks who've been uprooted, who've been chased from their native homelands. And the church in the West has been silent, Chris, and we've been talking about it. World leaders have brought their plight to the attention of the global community, but yet it seems in some ways we've been caught up in the election cycle here in the United States with other issues, economic, social issues, and the church has been deafening silent about it. And in some ways I wonder if, because of the level of atrocities that Christians are facing, the brutality, the sheer brutality of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and in some ways I feel like perhaps the church feels, what can we do? How can we respond? You know, we've brought it to the attention of our representatives in Washington, D.C., but nothing's being done. It doesn't seem like the situation is changing.
Yeah, final question, George. If people are asking these questions, what can be done and how should people be praying right now?
We've got to pray not just for protection, but many of the believers I meet across the world, you've met them, they don't necessarily ask, George, pray that I will be released from this situation, but pray that I will have the spiritual backbone to stand, the boldness to stand in the midst of evil and to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And open doors, pray that they will have open doors to share this love with their enemies. But we have to continue to pray for them, and also talk to our Congress people to say, listen, something needs to be done to stop this.
I would agree, George. Prayer changes things, and that's exactly what they do ask for. And we'll be watching and praying this coming year. Thank you, George.
You're most welcome.
That's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us throughout the week on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.